The world is wide, old gods whispering through red leaves, sea winds in broken crowns, dragons sleeping under dust. If this gentle journey through Westeros helps you drift, subscribe and stay with us. Settle in, traveler. The fire is warm and the night has many stories. Once, before the names were carved and the songs learned their words, the land itself breathed like a sleeping beast beneath a thin green skin, and rivers were the slow veins of a continent that had not yet chosen who would walk it. Fog lay on the barrows like folded blankets, and the first light did not rise so much as reveal, lifting the lid on forests that seemed older than memory, and cliffs that had heard the first gull cry and answered with stone. Weirwood stood like sentries who did not blink, white as bone, their red leaves whispering a language of rain and patience, and in that language the world kept a ledger of every footstep, every promise, every blood-warm lie. Shadows moved under branches where no human foot had trod, quick and delicate, like the thought you almost remember when sleep takes you again, and the moss drank dew from a sky that repeated itself in puddles. The children of the forest came like the wind arrives, not seen until it's already there, small figures with eyes that caught moonlight and kept it, hands on bark as if palms could read what roots were writing far below. They sang to stones and streams. They named fox dens and owl trees. They traced the old paths by scent and starlight, and when they spoke to one another, their voices felt like leaves brushing a traveler's cheek. Obsidian was their knight's inheritance, sharp and star-black, born of fire that once kissed the earth from beneath, and in the glass of it you could almost see a second world waiting behind your own. Greenseers sat with their backs to faces carved long before their birth, and the sap that streaked like tears down white bark told them truths in a slow red script, pooling at the roots like memory that refuses to fade. In those days, the forest was a cathedral without stone, and light that made it through the leaves turned every living thing into stained glass, and the ground gave in soft underfoot, as if the world were tired but kind. Then, like a new verse pushed into an ancient song, the first men came with bronze that flashed like summer lightning, horse lines dark against the horizons of uncut grass, axes wet with the dew of morning, and the sap of beginnings. They cut clearings where shadows had held counsel for 1,000 years. They set fires whose smoke braided with mist. They built with stubborn hands that translated hunger into walls, desire into roads. Where a long barrow lay, they measured. Where a stream wandered, they bridged. Where a hill rose, they crowned it with a ring of stones, as if asking the sky to look down and remember their names. The children watched with eyes that remembered how to listen, and the forest felt smaller in their chests for the first time, because a straight line had been drawn across a place that never liked straight lines. Conflict came not as thunder, but as many small frictions. An ash tree felled that held a listening place, a brook diverted that carried an old echo, a careless step onto an altar only the birds had noticed. Blood found the ground and vanished into it like rain into cracked earth, and where it vanished, the land kept it, and where it kept it, the trees knew. Battlefields bloomed like iron flowers in meadows that had only known wind, and bronze met bone, and songs older than speech were chased into bowls and caves by voices that did not know to lower themselves. But the world grows tired of sharpness eventually, and even wolves understand that hunger eats itself if left ungoverned, and so a circle was drawn beneath leaves lit like rubies, and a pact was pledged under faces that watched but did not judge. There were no trumpets when the truce took its first breath, only bird call and the hush of 1,000 small creatures resuming their many little lives, while larger creatures promised to become something else. The first men learned the names of streams that did not want new names, and the children accepted roads laid gently through the forest, as if a finger had traced a soft line across the back of a sleeping friend. Stone circles became courts, and courts became hearths, and at those hearths words were warmed and passed back and forth until the tongue of men tasted of bark smoke and leaf-sweet water. For a time the land exhaled, and the clearings did not feel like wounds, but like skylights where the sun could tell the forest what the sky had been doing. Then winter came with a memory older than the pact, and it came not as a season but as a story that had been waiting, and the world woke one morning to find that morning had not come. The dawn did not fail once. It failed again and again, until people forgot what it looked like to have shadows at their feet, and the cold found its way into marrow, where fear lives like a quiet tenant. Across the snow that kept its own counsel, things moved with a clarity that made even the most honest men doubt everything they had been told about death and warmth and the natural ways of endings. Flames bent low and complained. Steel became a pale stranger to the hands that gripped it. The beat of human hearts became the only drum that mattered in camps, where stories were the most valuable food. Somewhere between terror and faith, a wall was imagined, and once imagined, cut from the world like a single white note, held across the stave of the north, until sound became structure, and structure became salvation. Ice upon ice, block upon block, a straight line of stubbornness raised against a night that refused to blink, sewn into the fabric of the land by labor that turned breath into fog, and fog into legend. Men took vows that tasted like iron and frost, and those vows became blankets around their shoulders when all other warmth had been spent, and they raised their eyes to the sky as if checking whether it had remembered them. The long night lingered like the last words of a letter read too many times, and when it finally tore at the edges and let through a weak light, the world stepped into it carefully in case the light was a trick. After such cold, the first thaw felt like music played in a language no one remembered learning, and children born into the new morning grew with a sense that something had been promised to them and not yet delivered. The age of heroes was not a single age, but a quilt sewn from the stories kept by kitchen fires and keeps, and though the stitches are of 100 colors, the fabric warms the same. Bran the Builder walked through snowfall that welcomed him as if he were a returning son, and he listened where others spoke, and when he raised his hands to stone, the stone leaned in to hear. Winterfell rose from plans that sounded like prayer. Its halls nested like thoughts within thoughts, hot springs hidden under floors, as if the house kept a secret hearth in its bones. Walls learned the weight of snow and shrugged it off. Courtyards learned the footfall of wolves and smiled. Staircases learned the patient rhythm of someone old before their years and grew no steeper than necessary. To the south and east, where the sky was a restless drumhead and the sea kept score with impatient hands, a love pulled a mortal heart across the grain of the world and angered the air itself. Doran stood with his jaw set to the wind and got his answer in falling stone, and he stood again and learned to argue with storms by building until the storms lost interest in their own rage. Storm's End became a word the sea had to go around, a curve in a sentence that changed its meaning, and gulls traced circles on the updrafts as if drawing halos for a stubborn man. Far to the west, a golden story slipped into a darker one and came out smiling, a small figure with a brain like a key ring and a talent for doors that did not want to be opened. Lan the Clever walked into a problem and laughed softly, and when he walked out, the problem was holding the door for him, and Casterly Rock learned that stone is not immune to wit. Tunnels breathed cool secrets under candlelight. Gem seams caught the sun and kept it for evening. Lions found their bodies remembered how to stretch under a weight they had not yet earned. And out on salt water that did not forgive naming, the Ironborn listened to a god who spoke in bubbles and pressure, a god who kept what he took and took what he wanted. They baptized themselves into the idea that pain is a kind of clarity, and their boats bit the waves like narrow teeth, and the wind taught their hair to move like smoke. Axes found homes in driftwood and skull alike, and when they returned with songs, those songs were hard-edged and clean, like the surface of a sea in winter sunlight that refuses to warm you. Far away, a river remembered it was a god, and its people learned grace from the way it split light and carried it. And when war came, they carried their grace with them across a cruel horizon. Nymeria set her jaw and counted ships in a language only grief teaches, and dawn felt her approach like heat before a fire is struck, like the scent that precedes rain from a clear sky. 10,000 sails drew constellations across water that had never held so many stars, and when they burned, the names of the ships rose like a new constellation in smoke, and the sky learned them. Sand learned river, river learned sand, and a new thing walked between cactus and palm, a braid of two songs that kept both melodies alive without making either disappear. In the east, far beyond the lines Western maps dared to call the edge, a people learned to ride heat and name it kin, and cities grew from stone that remembered dragons as a kind of thunder with a heartbeat. Valyria shone like a held breath made architecture, and streets curled like the handwriting of someone in love with their own alphabet, and towers did not rise so much as grow from the ground in spirals that explained themselves to the sky. Dragons were not pets and never tools. They were questions asked by fire, answers written in shadow and light, and the men who claimed them were no more their masters than a candle owns its flame. Steel remembered the day it met dragon breath and never forgot it, and blades born from that meeting cut not only flesh, but history, and history bled willingly to be given that edge. But empires, like men, find their own weight eventually, and the ground beneath Valyria began to murmur, and the murmur became a rumble, and the rumble became a hymn no one wanted to sing. The doom happened the way a heart stops, suddenly to those watching, slowly to those who missed the beats that were already fading, and ash fell like gray snow on a world that had danced too close to its own brilliance. On Dragonstone, a basalt fortress that looked like something the sea had carved with patience rather than force, survivors turned their faces to winds that smelled of salt and omens and listened. The Targaryens kept their council and their dragons on that black-toothed rock, and Driftmark's gulls skimmed the wave wrinkles like white commas in a dark, unfinished sentence. Destiny is often a voice you don't hear until it's behind you, and the shore winds told that voice to speak up, and three shadows considered the mainland as if the tide could carry them to a throne. Aegon put his hand on a table where the world was flattened into obedience, and he did not lift his hand until lines had become routes and routes had become intentions. Conquest was not a single great roar. It was many quiet choices, many nights of maps and murmurs, many mornings of boots in dew, while ravens left with folded words. At the field of fire, heat corrected the arrogance of steel, and grass turned to glass beneath a sky that learned a new meaning for fear, and men who would have sung about their courage instead swallowed hard and thought of home. Castles looked at the sky and recognized at last that walls only go up, dragons go over, and when kings kneeled, the ground accepted their weight without comment, because the ground has seen worse and will again. A crown forged in flame is bright, but brightness does not equal sight, and heirs inherit not only metal, but math, the sum of promises made, and the interest that accrues when they are broken. Maegor strapped fear to his waist and called it policy, and the faith remembered that some bells tolled to gather sheep, and others to warn of wolves, and the realm learned where piety fits beside power. Wildfire hissed in glass as if jealous of candles, and heads rolled and were counted, and the stones of the city kept a ledger of footsteps that ran, hid, prayed, or swaggered. When a softer hand took the crown, roads spread like sutures across a wound, and bridges stitched trade into the ribs of towns, and laws were written with the humility of someone who has read ahead and knows how stories end. Jaehaerys listened like an artisan and ruled like a gardener, trimming not only weed and branch but also vanity, and marriages became knots that held what treaties could not. Peace does not sing loudly, it hums, and that hum threaded years together like beads, and children grew up thinking their lullabies were permanent, which is the only way lullabies work. But every garden grows at least one storm, and sometimes that storm has a face that smiles too easily, and a charm that cuts as neatly as a knife sharpened on compliments. In the spaces between law and inheritance, in the courtyards where whispers pool, in the galleries where portraits pretend to watch, seeds were being planted with careful hands. A rogue prince laughed where he should have bowed. A princess collected allies like shells. Green silk and black silk fluttered in rooms where the air seemed to hold its breath, and children learned the shape of crowns before they learned how heavy they were. Succession is a rope pulled by hands that swear they love you, and the fibers begin to fray in the middle long before anyone admits they can feel it in their palms. Dragons felt the tremor before men did, shivering in their sleep like hounds who have dreamed the hunt, and keepers looked at one another and said nothing because they did not yet have the words. When the dance began, it was clumsy, two partners stepping on each other because the music suddenly changed, and then it became a blaze, and the sky turned into a floorboards dreamt by mad musicians. Fire does not negotiate, and grief keeps poor accounts, and riders who had named their dragons with tenderness spoke that tenderness once more when falling, when wings tore, when the world rushed up and finally said no. Cities learn the color of ash in daylight and the taste of ash in bread, and children learn to sleep through distant roars, the way sailors learn to sleep through waves. The dance ended not because anyone won, but because the music burned itself out, and where there had been eggs, there were stones, and where there had been songs, there were old men saying, "Maybe it is better now." Stables that had housed thunder became museums of quiet, and torches waiting near them felt that there was no call for smoke tonight, perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps never again. But banners do not like to be still, and even when dragons sleep forever, men dream of dragons and act like them, and history, deprived of flame, tries steel once more. A black sword crossed the table, and with it crossed a question of who deserves the weight of a name, and the Dornish sands kept their own counsel, unbowed, unbent, unbroken, as if the sun itself refused to kneel. On small roads where chickens and dust were the only witnesses, a hedge knight and a boy carried decency like a secret weapon, and the realm, in their company, felt briefly less complicated. At Summerhall, wishes were gathered like tinder, and music lilted like a promise, and the night took more than it gave, and rain applauded the end of something that had never fully begun. Aerys wore beauty like a borrowed cloak, and returned it stained with fear, and Wildfire learned the shape of his smile, and courtiers measured their words with the care of men packing explosives. Rebellion came the way dawn always does, after too much night, and then all at once, and the hammer that fell did not ask permission of armor, and a tower learned that secret love can have a terrible echo. The realm breathed again, but shallowly, the way a survivor breathes when the doctor says you may go home but does not say for how long, and winter watched from hundreds of miles away and said nothing. On rocky shores, where salt has the last word, Ironborn lit pyres for pride, and paid in suns to prove a point the sea had been making since the first net was cast. It takes what it will, and you may keep what you can hold. Great houses arranged themselves like careful pieces on a board that no longer had a full rule book, and each banner slept lightly, listening north because the snow was telling stories again in the old measured voice. Prophecy threaded silences with silver wire and some swore they could hear a song behind the walls of the world, a song that required two voices and would not be satisfied with a solo. A blade warmed slowly by a hearth told a story of the day it might need to be more than a cooking spit, and a raven preened its wing as if smoothing the crease of an unspoken letter. Beneath red leaves that never tire of falling, the faces watched as they always do, patient as stone and more forgiving, because they remember everything and still let people sleep under their branches. And somewhere far beyond what the maps pretend to know, beyond where sailcloth remembers the taste of salt and the spine of the world hums under snow, an old cold thought opened its eyes. But that too is a story that will keep until you are ready to hear it. And for now, the night is gentle and the fires banked, and the wolves curl around each other like commas in a sentence that means rest. Valyria rose like a held breath, a city that learned to stand in conversation with mountains and reply in spires. A chorus of arches and aqueducts singing to the sun, streets curled like dragon tails, smooth stone warmed by centuries of footsteps that believed they were walking on the back of destiny. In forges that glowed like small dawns, smiths taught steel to remember fire, and the metal listened, taking a sheen that looked like night made into a mirror. Above it all, the air wrote careful lines around wings, and those wings cast shadows that made even the most stubborn walls feel brief. Dragon flame braided with wind, and wind braided with chant, and in that weave the freehold learned the trick of turning fear into policy and wonder into routine. Oh, great roads ran outward like quiet commandments, connecting client kingdoms the way rivers connect lakes, and caravans followed those roads as if following a lullaby. Scholar priests counted eclipses and epiphanies, and their counting convinced them the world could be negotiated with if addressed correctly and often. Libraries circled their own light like patient moons, filled with pages that smelled of oil and salt, as if the sea had kissed every secret and let it go. Children learned letters by tracing them in ash across heating stones, while their elders watched flames and named shapes within them, the way sailors name stars. Markets rang with soft haggles and the clink of coin, perfumes tugging memories from passers-by who had no idea those memories could be bought and sold. In tiled courtyards, fountains wrote poems in water, stanzas that began at a lion's mouth and ended in a basin full of coin-bright wishes. And yet, beneath the rhythm and the glory, the ground hummed, a note only the most sleepless could hear, a reminder that all music ends. Some heard dreams of smoke before noon, deep and specific, as if someone whispered tomorrow's weather from inside the bedrock. Others felt a fatigue in the city's joints, an ache in bridges and causeways that no mason could quite explain with craft alone. When the day came, the sky did what stories say the sky never does. It folded. Peaks ruptured as if they were lungs that had held too much heat for too long, and the breath they exhaled ate horizons. Streets that had known only processions and parades became rivers of fire, and stone softened like wax under a candle's patient stare. Towers shuddered, threw their bells to the ground, and then followed them, ringing one last time the only note that matters when endings arrive. Dragons rose into a heaven that had forgotten how to hold them, wings torn by winds that did not exist yesterday, throats screaming in languages older than speech. Ash came on, not as a flurry, but as a season, settling on ships that never made harbor, clinging to the hair of kings, covering the names carved beneath statues until all names were the same. From that choir of endings, a single island kept time with a different drum. Dragonstone stood like a tooth the sea could not spit out, black and stubborn, its walls wet with endless salt and the patience of basalt. Here, a family listened to a young voice that dreamed too accurately, a warning wrapped in images of heat and falling sky. They brought their books and their bones and their bright-winged cousins, and when the world behind them became red night, they watched from parapets of carved scale. The surf wrote the same sentence again and again at the base of the cliffs, and the sentence meant wait. Driftmark trimmed its sails to the new wind, and shipwrights ran their hands along keel lines as if those lines were a prayer to balance. On dark throne steps that remembered stormlight, men and women counted options the way a careful gambler counts cards, not hoping for luck, but for pattern. Across the narrow sea, Westeros slept with one eye open, dreaming of old kings and new taxes, unaware that the dreamer on Dragonstone planned to fold the continent into a single sleep. A table shaped like the world rested under candlelight, its painted rivers glistening like veins, its mountains casting small shadows with very real sharpness. Hands settled on that table and did not lift for a long time, tracing distances with the same calm that a scribe uses to ink an oath. Ravens left with letters that felt heavy, not because of wax or seal, but because of intention in the lines they carried. When sails were finally raised, they went up like silhouettes of a decision, and the wind accepted them without asking for proof. The mouth of Blackwater Bay opened like a pause, and a city on 7 hills pretended not to notice what tradition cannot admit until it is directly addressed. Castles along the way learned a new etiquette: how to look up and kneel, how to consider stone not a shield, but a bowl on a table where dragons feed. At Harrenhal, pride had been baked into walls the way raisins are baked into bread, and those walls rose and rose until they had no patience left for humility. Flame taught them the lesson pride refuses to read while the ink is still wet, and when the lesson ended, the stone learned to slump. Iron glowed, ran, cooled, and kept the memory of a hand it would never hold again, and halls that loved echo learned silence instead. In the reach of open field where armies measure themselves by neighbors, the air thickened and grass crisped beneath a sun that has seen battles and still flinched. 3 shadows came low and wide, a geometry of fire, and the field of fire remembered its name only after it earned it again. Armor learned the limits of brilliance. Swords learned the taste of their own handles, and men learned the speed at which courage converts into survival. Knights who had trained a lifetime for the exact wrong kind of war staggered, humbled, alive, breathing, counting blessings as if counting stars. Far to the north, a king stood on a riverbank that had cradled his line since before the first road learned to be straight, and he looked at the sun, and then the snow, and then the ravens. He rode south with an army that was not an army, but a statement about what endures, and when he saw what waited, he knelt, and in kneeling he kept something larger standing. Old Town's bells remembered how to ring welcome instead of alarm, and a high septon considered prophecy and prudence, and found they were today the same word. In a sept that breathed incense and patience, a crown touched a brow as lightly as a hand touches a child's hair when the child sleeps. The city on 7 hills agreed to a new grammar of rule, and a throne was forged from the argument of blades, welded by heat into a chair that made the sitter honest, at least to himself. When you sit on knives, you are reminded to weigh every word. When you rule a realm, you learn each word weighs someone's day. The Red Keep grew above chambers and tunnels and doorways left where secrets might want to walk, and the river curled below as if to say it had seen worse and would again. For a while the dragons nested, and the dragons nested not in barns or stables, but in the space between awe and routine, a category men create whenever the miraculous becomes daily. Banners came and went in orderly choreography. Marriages folded regions into new fabrics, and coin learned to travel more smoothly than grievance. But within the arithmetic of oaths and inheritances, there are always remainders, small bits that don't fit the table, and those bits roll into corners and grow teeth. A king rose who believed fear was faster than respect, and he was not wrong about speed, only about distance. Edicts became edges, and the faith wore armor over its prayers, and the city learned the sound of bells that meant drawbridges, bar doors, hide the children. Polygamy turned from whispered scandal into policy, and policy hardened into a blade that cut at the fabric of consent. Battlements saw the silhouettes of pikes rising from streets that were supposed to be for bread and barter, and on those pikes hung certainty that the crown could not afford to misread. Some nights, the river carried glints of green beneath moonlight. Jars of a jealous fire turned liquid threat, and the smell of it lived behind the teeth of everyone who had breathed too near. Builders who knew too much vanished into the math of a paranoid mind, and the Red Keep's passageways learned to keep secrets even from the men who cleared their dust. When Balerian's shadow crossed the yard, even the bravest men shivered, not because they feared death, but because they feared the quickness with which a decision could erase them. A sept burned and threw prayers into the night as smoke, and that smoke wrote its own psalms on the sky, and there were some who read them and changed nothing. The faith militant raised 7-pointed stars into shields and marched, and in their march was a refusal to be drafted by terror into obedience. There were battles on rooftops, in cloisters, down alleys where laundry had hung that morning, and the city felt itself divided into map squares no cartographer had drawn. After so much iron, a silence fell. Even cruelty must rest. When rest came, it wore the face of a king who remembered that a road is a kind of mercy. He married patience to purpose and called the Union law. He tied coasts to uplands with stone and timber. He reminded the realm that words spoken in the morning can protect a man at dusk. Courtiers learned to speak without flattery and be heard, and small folk learned to speak without fear and be answered. And though neither happened always, both happened enough to matter. A queen looked north along roads she had helped lay, and saw a wall of ice that kept its own counsel, and she brought gifts to men who had made their lives into vows. At the wall, wind carved its lesson across cheeks and lips, and dragons flapped once, and then again, and then refused, as if the cold itself had a word that meant no. Silver wings turned back from blankness that felt like an old god's unblinking eye, and riders softened their hand and let the beasts choose the direction. The queen laughed softly and did not press, because love can be a kind of intelligence when it remembers that a no may save a life. Back in the south, laws were gathered like scattered wheat and milled into bread everyone could chew, a code that asked not what was grand, but what was daily. Shepherds learned what fences they might build without losing their pasture. Fishers learned where to lay nets without tangling with their neighbor's boat. Widows learned what inheritance meant when a man's word had blown away like chaff. Disputes that would once have called for blood were solved by ink, and though ink is not always just, it stains less. Bridges carried carts and couples, songs and rumors, and the hum of those crossings sounded like civilization. In Old Town's towers, candles burned low while pens scratched names and lineages into histories that would make sense of the coming confusions. At court, children collected in windows and courtyards like beads on a string that would one day be pulled taut by a hand none of them had met yet. Governors of small holds learned the pleasure of an empty jail and the efficiency of a full granary, and they told their accountants to keep numbers clean and their captains to keep swords oiled, but sheathed. Across the realm, the Redwine Straits wore grooves from so many keels that even the fish could have plotted trade routes. In dawn, sun lingered on stone long after dusk, and Dornish law kept its own tempo within the larger music, a respectful syncopation. In the north, wolves learned again to circle close to halls warmed by hidden springs, and ravens made shorter journeys, and letters carried more greetings than warnings. The Iron Islands stormed and sulked in alternation, the sea like an older brother endlessly amused by the stubbornness of younger siblings. In the Riverlands, water changed its mind the way it always has, and farmers learned once more to tie their hopes to flood marks and patience. The Vale kept its watch from high perches, and the mountains pretended they had no roads, as if only eagles and stubborn men were invited to pass. The Westerlands rang with hammers in good years and with stories in lean ones, and the rock held as rock does when fed by careful hands. In the Reach, orchards perfumed mornings like soft arguments for peace, and knights tested lances amid laughter that sounded like wealth. King's Landing watered its streets only sometimes and smelled like ambition at midday, like jasmine and hot stone by evening, like secrets whenever the moon tilted just so. If there were cracks, they were hair-thin, visible only to those who make a habit of bending close to examine gloss. If there were shadows, they were the normal sort, under benches, behind thresholds, rather than the kind that carry teeth. But time, which is better at arithmetic than kings, counted years and laid them out like cups on a board, and began to fill them with small accidents. A road washed out where the soil had been rushed. A truce faltered where an apology should have been. A cousin married in one county instead of another, and a feast sat two rivals too close together. A prophecy whispered to a girl who didn't want it. A boy dreamed of a crown and woke with a bruise he could not explain. An uncle remembered a slight he had pretended to forget. Seeds do not know which hand planted them. They only know the rhythm of water and the amount of shade, the long piece-stitched banners to roof beams, and the seams looked permanent until a breath caught, a thread loosened, and a corner lifted. Even so, the realm slept easier than it had in living memory, and that ease felt like a blanket laid over the knees of an old soldier by a grandchild who has not yet learned why such gestures matter. And in that soft, wide quiet, the Iron Throne learned to creak with less complaint, and the Red Keep learned to exhale, and the dragons, fewer now, drowsed in sunstruck courtyards like living epilogues. On certain afternoons, the king walked through gardens that were very nearly humble, and he touched leaves and asked their names, and found he had not forgotten any. The queen wrote letters in a hand that never rushed, and sometimes her pen lifted because she was smiling at a memory of river breeze or north wind, or the way a young knight had bowed, as if his spine were made of melody, not bone. At feasts, the music kept to modest volume, as if not to wake the past, and the toasts never ran long enough to tempt the future. Stories told by nurses to children went back further than the children could count, and if those stories disagreed, well, every child learns eventually that truth wears more than one cloak. In 1,000 cottages and 100 keeps, sleep found cheeks and brows without hunting, and pillows learned tears only from laughter or dreams about brand new foals trying their legs. Even in the shadowed streets where hunger is known by name, the lanterns burned a little longer, and hands reached without flinching to take bread shared from a loaf that had been sliced with a steady blade. The sea remained itself, capricious, fair, devout in its obedience to no one, and yet even it seemed to allow more safe returns than storms for a handful of years. On Dragonstone, waves continued their sentence, patient and exact, and gulls wrote punctuation marks in the salt air, commas and question marks, and sometimes ellipses. The painted table gathered dust in places where no finger had traced a new campaign, and to that dust the island gave a kind of respect. In Old Town, a glass candle flickered sometimes and sometimes not, and men wrote essays on whether that meant anything and then politely disagreed and went home to supper. A generation was born who thought that peace is the default state of a world, that war is a story told to frighten and to entertain, not to warn. They grew tall and strong and careless in the way only the safe can afford, and their laughter went up through open windows into violet evenings. They learned to ride and to reckon, to flirt and to forge, to pledge and to plot, but their plotting was play, their pledges soft. In little river towns, boys threw stones to make circles on the water, and girls braided each other's hair with flowers, and someone said, "We will do this tomorrow," and everyone believed it. In the Winterfell Godswood, a girl learned the stillness required to hear her own breath under the greater breathing of the leaves, and in Casterly Rock, a boy learned the value of counting slowly. In the Vale, A child stood at a ledge, felt the wind push and pull, and understood for the first time the word careful. In Sunspear, a girl watched the sun blur into the sea and chose a word for courage that tasted of salt. In Pike, a boy stared at a storm until he convinced himself it blinked first. And in Highgarden, a child ran through corridors of summer and learned that wealth, too, is a maze. In King's Landing, a rat found a crust, a merchant found a margin, a poet found a rhyme, and a guardsman found an excuse to stand a little longer near a door where the air was cooler. The age turned a page without ceremony, as ages prefer, and the ink dried clear. If you listened closely in that quiet, you could hear the distant clink of a cup being set too hard on a table in a hall far from court. You could hear the tremor of a rumor testing its legs in a marketplace where the fishmonger was not buying today's lies because yesterday's was still fresh. You could hear down long stone corridors the soft echo of a pair of boots belonging to a man who believed the crown had a right to be worn the way a sword has a right to be sharpened. You could hear outside city walls hooves as steady as a prayer. You could hear, far beyond it all, the shifting of ice in a place where ice does not need to shift to command respect. And perhaps, if your breathing slowed enough, you could hear the faintest rasp of scales against sun-warmed stone, as if an old chapter had not yet ended, merely paused in mid-sentence, waiting for the reader to settle more comfortably into the chair. The hall was warm and kind, and that was the beginning of the trouble, because warmth invites sleep, and sleep invites dreams, and dreams are where crowns choose their next heads. Viserys smiled the way a man smiles who believes the world is a chair he already sat in, gentle, content, pleased to lift a cup and close old disputes with a story about childhood summers that grew finer the farther away they wandered. He named his daughter the light that would follow him, and candles in the Red Keep leaned toward her as if wicks could bow, and for a heartbeat the realm remembered that a promise can be a lullaby sung across generations. On Dragonstone, sea wind salted every vow until it tasted honest, and a princess stood beside a cradle like a small harbor, and the cradle held futures that would one day argue with each other in the voices of boys. In Old Town, a bell chimed that was not on any tower, a bell made of ambition and patience, and a family with green in their eyes began to measure steps as carefully as a man descending a steep stair in the dark. In the Godswood at King's Landing, the face in the tree watched a girl in green, who watched a girl in black, who watched a city that did not know it was about to become a question that no one would answer softly. The feast nights multiplied, and with them the small hesitations, the half-jokes, the glances polished smooth by repetition until they slid like knives through silk, and courtiers learned to sleep with one ear open for the sound of a crown thinking. There is a part of the castle where the walls cool slower than the rest, and in that warmth secrets learn to hatch, and one of them hatched with a name that meant rightful to some and problem to others and storm to everyone. Brothers who loved each other like mirrors love. Faces met and parted, and one of them laughed too loud, and one of them held his laughter the way a hawk holds a field mouse, and the laughter and the silence both tasted of dragons. Children played in corridors with toy knights and toy queens, and a toy throne that pricked the fingers of dolls, and nurses told them to be careful, and the children were careful, which is not the same as safe. When the king's breath grew thin, the city learned to listen to fabric, because the rustle of a curtain can be a herald, and the fold of a sheet can be a decree, and the sigh at midnight can summon horsemen by dawn. He spoke names into the dim, and names carry in the dim better than in daylight, because daylight has to share with everything else, and the dim has only breath to keep it company. The morning that followed wore soft shoes, and soft shoes walk quickly, and by the time the city learned the truth, another truth had been told to the right ears first, and a door clicked shut somewhere behind a smile. Keys turned, and then did not turn, and those who would have shouted found their throats obediently dry, and a clerk with a careful beard folded his hands, placed them on the table, and discovered he had chosen a side, without speaking. A lord who had counted reins the way other men count rings on a tree spoke up like principle in a fable, and silence discovered its own weight, and then a blade drew a line under his sentence and declared it complete. The bells did not ring because bells belong to the city, and the city had not been asked. And when bells are ignored, they remember how to sulk. Green cloth and black cloth fluttered in different corners of the same rooms, and the rooms grew smaller without losing an inch, which is how it feels when an argument uses air for kindling. In the royal apartments, a mother held her son and told him the sky would honor the law if he looked at it firmly enough, and in another tower a daughter held her sons and told them the sea recognizes the blood it has watched from cliffs for generations. On a storm road, a boy with salt in his hair and a letter in his glove turned his dragon toward a house that keeps its own weather, hoping rain would be made of courtesy. The Castle of Storms taught him that weather and courtesy are cousins who grew up in different neighborhoods, and the boy learned another cousin's name, which was cruelty, and the sky learned the sound a message makes when it breaks. Wings fought wind on the ride home, and the wind brought a bigger shadow with it, and the boy discovered that fear has a size, and that size can be measured against a night so large it forgets how to end. Sea and cloud and lightning and teeth argued, and afterward the sea kept what it keeps, and the sky kept nothing, and the news returned without the messenger, which is the loneliest way for news to travel. Back in the Red Keep, a whisper crawled through sawdust and wine spills, upstairs and under doors, found a mother's ear, and made a sound no language deserves, not even the languages used for war. Sorrow makes a decision look like a rope ladder leading down from a burning room, and men who catch it feel saved while they descend, even if the ladder leads to a cellar full of smoke. Orders went out, and they were not written in ink, and they were not folded, and they were not sealed, and yet they carried, as orders do when they use grief as their hawker. In a place beneath the palace, two men told a woman there were rules here, and the rules wore masks and called themselves punishment, and a small life was harvested to balance the scales of an anger that would never balance. The night that followed everywhere was narrower, and meals tasted like iron, and every cradle in the city learned to flinch when doors opened, because doors opening had newly learned how to end songs. The Black Standard found friends along coasts where salt has taught patience, and the Green found friends inland where wind has taught caution, and the realm became a loom, threads pulled until the cloth shrieked. Men who had once argued about tariffs now argued about dragons, and men who had once argued about dragons now argued about sons, and the words rightful and usurpation fell into cups and soured the wine. Steel that had once been polished to see a lover's smile now learned to hold heat, and the hands that held that steel learned to shake and then to steady themselves, and steadiness became a habit stronger than mercy. A queen in black looked at a painted table that had taught her to count, and she counted ships, counted riders, counted loyalties, and the numbers did not make music yet, but there was a tune in them if played with care. A mother in green looked at the same city from a different window and counted differently, counted silence, counted the distance between two brothers flying in different directions, counted the days since sleep had visited kindly. Rooks nested in the bones of an old castle that had once called itself unburnable, and a princess with silver hair strapped courage around her ribs and went to tell the birds that fortunes change. She met sunlit gold and older shadow, and the sky became a sentence that refused to end, and when it ended with a period made of ash and a silence that would be mentioned in kitchens for years. In the river mouths where tongues do their best work, fleets kissed and bit, flags tore, masts leaned like drunks, and the sea counted each plank as it took it. Boys became command, when their fathers sank before finishing the last sentence of a prayer, and the sea listened to both versions with the same attention it gives to thunder and to lullabies. On Driftmark, the gulls forgot how to laugh for a morning, and on Dragonstone the tide left a crooked line of shells that spelled not yet in a language the patient understand. In the city, Smoke learned new streets, and the dragon keepers counted names at night, and their counts stopped and started and stopped again, like a man learning to breathe in unfamiliar air. They spoke to riders who did not have noble blood, but had hands that did not tremble when heat pressed against skin, and they taught those hands the older words the beasts respect. Some of those hands lifted in loyalty and stayed, and some lifted in greed and then wandered, and the line between loyalty and greed walked down the middle of the same road like a drunk trying not to stagger. A man built like a mountain climbed onto a legend and felt like a child again, which told him everything he needed to know about the danger he was in, and not enough about the danger he would become to others. Another man older than his lies found a saddle where he had expected a story, and decided that stories are better when they come with teeth. They were given titles that glittered and knights that did not, and when they slept they dreamed of crowns made of flame that did not burn, and when they woke they believed the dream's liar. The battle that followed in the soft fields near a town that liked to sell bread found those men eager to become chapters, and chapters they became, written in a script that cuts fingers. Old friends forgot how to be old and forgot how to be friends, and kings named in hope turned their faces from the sky and learned to read the language of falling. Horses that had never known fear learned it as a smell and as a word, and carts overturned to make walls for men who remembered they still preferred to live. The town heard songs written with panic and left its ovens to listen, because everyone listens when history passes within the length of a loaf. Night fell and rose and fell again, and in the dark men who roused dragons learned whether they had roused loyalty or appetite, and those lessons were not uniform. Betrayal grew like mold on bread left too long in a warm room, and the warm room was a court, and the bread was trust, and the mold fed everyone, whether they saw it or not. Two dragons met in a sky so full of witnesses even the stars felt shy, and the larger one remembered a cave from long ago where a child had whispered a promise, and the smaller one remembered a hand that had patted its neck after a clumsy landing. Memory does not save anyone, but it is a kind companion on the way to an ending, and they ended as all endings end, with a noise and a quiet, and the quiet is always longer. The city's vaults kept jars of green fire like jealous thoughts, and on the worst night, a rope of desperate people pulled them open and taught the streets the taste of a new color. Windows became mouths, and mouths screamed, and screams learned to echo, and echo learned to circle, and circling learned to stampede. In the dragon pit, a crowd remembered how much it hated what it had admired, and that is the most dangerous memory of all. They climbed and clawed and threw and burned and bled, and above them the great, patient creatures tried to decide whether this was a hunt or a plague, or a dream that would end if only they settled back to sleep. A girl in a dress meant for a festival reached and touched a scale that was warmer than she'd expected, and for a second the world was kind, and then the world was not. Names that had filled the air of ballads fell to the ground like broken instruments, and the music of the realm lost octaves it never learned to replace. On a bridge of black rock, where the sea loves to whisper about the price of longing, a queen rode toward a throne that had noticed her since she was little and had been waiting to hurt her with equilibrium the way it hurts everyone. The city opened its gates not because it was conquered, but because it was tired, and tired cities surrender better than brave ones, because they understand the value of stopping. The throne accepted her and pricked her and accepted her again, because that is its habit, and she handled the pain as if it were a reminder from a tutor trying to be kind. For a moment, kitchens hummed with relief, and wine tasted like grapes rather than like memory, and the smell of the river improved, as if the water itself had been holding its breath. But grief is patient and does not respect changes of management, and men who had once sworn one way learned to swear another, and messengers began to run again with the pace of bad weather. A mother who had lost everything but the hinges of her will tightened those hinges and found she could still open doors, and behind one door waited a brother who had not forgiven gravity for pulling him toward the ground during their youth. His dragon lay broken somewhere that was not here, and his back ached the way years ache when they remember exactly when they began. And he learned on foot what he had once learned in flight, which is that revenge walks. A meeting happened where meetings ought not happen, under a sky that pretended to be neutral, and older sins nodded to newer ones, and a bargain scrawled itself in air that smelled of fish and treachery. The queen walked corridors she had known as a girl and took comfort from the fact that the stones remembered her feet. And then she turned a corner, and someone else's memory walked toward her wearing armor too bright for such a dark idea. The hall filled with people who were not welcome and never would be, and she learned that a throne room is only a room once the wrong people find it. They took her not toward a cell, but toward the oldest mouth of power she had ever known, and the beast that waited there had healed enough to remember how to open, and the knight looked away. The sound those jaws made became a legend told by people who were not there, because that is how legends protect those who tell them from believing they could have done anything. News returned to the city with a gait that said it had done its best to arrive later, and yet here it was, and those who heard it broke like shells under a careless heel. Children forgot which side to blame and blamed each other, and then forgot what blame meant, and stared at walls as if walls could offer milk or toys or absolution. The war groaned again as if a sleeper turning onto a sore shoulder, and the sore shoulder was the country, and the groan went on for months, because that is how bodies complain when they cannot get up. In a half-ruined town, two armies met like drunks meeting a wall, not in neat lines, but in confusions of intention, and lords betrayed oaths they thought they had already betrayed yesterday, which suggests betrayal is a habit, not an event. A rider young enough to be anyone's son found a courage older than his name, and bought time with the only currency that kingdoms accept during crises, which is his heartbeat. The larger beasts roared, and one of them remembered an old rider who had given it sugar from a palm, and still it killed, because hunger and training and fear mean more than candy. In the second dawn, after the second fire in that same place, the smoke finally lost interest in being a wall and became a question instead. And the question was, what now? The answer was that there were fewer of everything, fewer chairs occupied, fewer princes crisping apples above hearths, fewer old women telling the filthy jokes that keep kitchens brave, fewer horses that remembered the names their grooms had sung into their manes, fewer dragons. On the island of the table and the tower, a young queen's consort learned to count differently, to count not up, but down, and on the last number, he understood that numbers do not love anyone. He took a ship and a son and a terrible oath and sailed into a fog that thought it was a future, and when he came back the fog had stiffened into shape. The Green King's body remembered poison the way a song remembers its chorus, and his reign ended in a cup passed by a hand that had once tried to hold back a tide with only prayer. People said it was justice, and people said it was sin, and people said it was Tuesday, and all of them were right according to the clocks they used to measure their days. The boy who inherited had a face the painters loved, because it promised to cause them no trouble, and behind that calm was a winter that had lost its wolves. He married the memory of what had been done, and the hope of what might be mended, and the marriage took, in the way that grafts sometimes take if you water them, and do not ask them to bear fruit too quickly. The councils met and argued and adjourned and met again, and every time they met a dragon was remembered and then forgotten more completely, and the forgetting felt like snow falling on footprints. In holds where playrooms had once housed hatchlings, children played with toys shaped like ships instead, and the toys did not burn their fingers and did not fly them into the sky and did not roar at bedtime. One last rider took the last willing mount, and they found they could love each other without winning. And that is a lesson some marriages never learn. They left when the world began to ask questions they did not want to answer, and they found a country where the hills looked like sleeping animals, and the people like shepherds who loved the animals too much to eat them. Elsewhere, a woman who had been accused of loving too precisely disappeared into the weather and became a story that teenage boys told to make each other shiver and to excuse their own tenderness. On a hill where the air is always thinner than the day before, an old dragon came to rest, and a younger one came to visit, and neither found the other welcome or unwelcome, which is a kind of peace more honest than most treaties. Silverwing circled a field where no one waited, and then circled again, as if remembering a hand that would never rise, and then landed beside bones that had once laughed like thunder. In the Riverlands, a blackened keep decided to remain ruined as a lesson, rather than rebuild and risk being proud again. And sometimes a ruin is more beautiful because it admits the price of beauty. In King's Landing, the dragon pit collapsed into itself like a tired lung, and grass learned how to sprout between flagstones that had known only talon scrape and echo. The small folk grew herbs where once they grew gossip, and the gossip that remained was gentler, about births and bread, and the warm days when laundry dries in an hour. In Old Town, a novice wrote the first line of a book he did not intend to finish, and in that first line, he made peace with the idea that not finishing can sometimes be the most truthful way to write. He put down that dragons once held the sky the way a mother holds a sleeping child, and that the sky has hands of its own, and that sometimes it must put the child down. Across the realm, bards tuned their instruments lower, and singers lengthened their rests, and music remembered that silence is a note that deserves to be played more often. Masons wiped soot from stones and discovered the old pattern still there, and chose to follow them, and the walls rose new but remembering, and the lanes straightened like spines after a long sadness. On Dragonstone, the waves spoke the same sentence, and the sentence still meant wait. But for once the island answered out loud, and the answer was a word like rest. In the space that dragons vacated, other creatures took up residence. Smaller stories, kinder gears, wheels that turn without grinding. A beekeeper in the Reach learned that hives hum like harps, and he wrote to a cousin in the city to come here, and the cousin came. And for an afternoon, the only war in the world was between sunlight and the sweetness that tries to hide inside flowers. A shipwright in the islands found a way to make a hull whisper less when it cuts water, and he launched a boat that slid like an apology, and everyone who saw it felt their shoulders stand a little taller. A girl in the north stood under red leaves and decided she would be a lawsome woman, which is a woman who knows where a line should be and why, and she learned the names of boundary stones and the habits of snow. A boy in Dawn climbed a wall no one had climbed since his great-grandmother's time, and found on top of it a carving of a lizard with wings and a crown, and he rubbed it until it shone, and then left it there to watch sunsets. In the Vale, a shepherd found an old scale, and wore it as a charm, and his lambs thrived. And his daughter said it was luck, and he said it was just a thing, and the truth sat between them smiling. At a feast in Highgarden, someone told a joke about kings who think they are dragons, and the punchline was that dragons probably think they are gardeners, and everyone laughed and no one was angry. In the Westerlands, a miner broke into a vein that had been waiting for exactly this strike of exactly this pick, and he paused and said thank you into the rock, and the rock kept its comment to itself. On the Trident, fishermen hauled a net heavy with fish and heavy with stories, and they ate the fish and traded the stories, and neither was entirely believed, which is the right way to live. In King's Landing, a baker invented a pastry shaped like a spiral that unwinds as you eat it and leaves a flake trail across your plate, like a map showing how far you have come. And people bought it because journeys are delicious when they end in sugar. At night, the city slept more often than it didn't, and when it didn't, it was because of ordinary reasons, like new babies, or drunk uncles, or lovers who forget that walls are thinner than vows. The realm found a rhythm again, and it was not the rhythm of drums under banners, but the quiet rhythm of nails in wood, and seeds in furrows, and ink on ledgers, and rain on roofs. Men with swords still oiled them, because one should keep tools ready. But the swords did not get the first word in a room, and sometimes they did not get any word at all, and learned to bear it. The throne creaked and did not cut as often, because the man who sat in it learned how to breathe without bracing against every breath, and the metal respected his restraint. He looked north and south and east and west, and saw fewer fires, and the fires he saw were hearths, and he told himself that was enough, and he was not wrong. He walked in gardens, where the trees were too young to give much shade, and did not mind the sun on his neck, because that kind of heat does not judge, it only warms. He listened to his advisers argue about grain and bridges, and he found, to his surprise, that such arguments contain fewer dead ends than arguments about lineage and honor and dragons. He kept a small room without tapestries where he went to be alone, and on the table there he kept a pebble he had found on a beach when he was a boy, smooth and gray and ordinary and perfect. Sometimes he held it until his hand knew its shape, and then he set it down, and then he signed something he had needed to sign, and then he slept, not as a king sleeps, but as a person sleeps. Beyond his walls, winter practiced its scales. Summer rehearsed its exit, autumn warmed up its tear brass voice, and spring napped with one eye open. In fields far from courts and courts far from fields, the people of the realm learned to tell the story of the time the sky forgot to be kind, and they told it so that children would ask questions, and elders would answer slowly. They did not all use the same names, and they did not all use the same blame, and that was healthy, because a story with only one flavor is a medicine, not a meal. They did not agree on who was right, and they did not agree on what right means, and that was healthy, because agreement that thick chokes the throat. They agreed on this, though, even when they did not say it out loud, even when they did not know they agreed. They agreed that dragons are beautiful, and that beauty can be heavy, and that heavy things fall, and that falling hurts, and that hurt can teach, and that learning is a kind of mercy if you let it be. And in the long hush after the long roar, when night settled and lamps were trimmed and shutters latched, and dogs curled at doors and kittens bumped noses and candles hesitated before releasing their last wisps of smoke, the realm began to dream again. It dreamed of skies where nothing chased anything, and of waters that carried without drowning, and of beds that remembered every sleeper and held them like promises not made to be broken. It dreamed of dragons, too, but differently, not as masters or monsters, but as old friends whose letters still arrive now and then, bringing news from a country you no longer live in, warm with the ink of distance. It dreamed, and in the dream the grass grew, and in the grass the dew collected, and in the dew a tiny world saw itself reflected, round and bright and complete, and anyone awake enough to notice found that their breathing slowed to match the pace of something ancient and forgiving. The dream went on into the hour when bakers wake and drunks lie down, into the hour when sailors judge a breeze by its smell, and mothers correct blankets without opening their eyes, into the hour when the first bird considers the first note and decides to wait one more heartbeat. In that hour, The ash of old fires caught silver, and the faces in old trees grew softer, and the stones in old towers let in a little more dawn. And when the sun finally lifted, not to conquer but to remind, the whole realm knew the taste of quiet on its tongue, and swallowed, and did not speak, and did not need to, because the silence itself told them they were still here, and would be for a while, and perhaps, if they were careful, for longer than that. In council chambers where sunlight fell through windows like measured mercy, regents argued gently and fiercely by turns, and the boy who was king sat and listened, and learned the shape of power from the edges it leaves on quiet people. He watched men who loved the realm as fathers love unpromising sons, with patience mixed with dread, and women who loved it the way a mother loves a fevered child, with cool cloths and blunt truth, and a refusal to panic in front of servants. He learned how a signature can be a sword that cuts rumor, and how a pause can be a rope thrown to a drowning man, and how sometimes the most royal act is to keep your temper when everyone else has hired theirs out by the hour. When advisors left, they bowed deeply and began whispering before the door had finished closing, because whispering is how people who can't afford to shout keep themselves from breaking, and some of their whispers were wise, and some were weary, and all were human. He walked the gardens too, a thinner boy under a thicker sky, and the gardeners bowed without stopping their work, because plants do not wait for princes, and the best teachers are busy while you learn. He stopped by ponds and saw fish that had nowhere else to be, and felt for a moment jealous of their certainty. And then a frog leapt and made a ring that widened until it touched a lily, and he smiled, because even certainty can be changed by the lightest touch. In the archives, he touched the spines of books he would not read yet, and perhaps never would, finding, as fingers do, that knowledge has texture, that some wisdoms are smooth and some are rough, and each leaves a different memory in the skin. A maester with hair the color of old paper explained carefully how records survive by being boring most of the time, and how history is a feast that needs broth as much as it needs meat. And the boy nodded as if he liked soup. He learned to play civis without pretending to enjoy it, and to lose pleasantly when losing was useful, and to win quietly when winning would embarrass someone he still needed tomorrow. He learned that sometimes you say yes and send flour instead of soldiers, and sometimes you say no and send a singer, because a good ballad is an army that can cross mountains without eating your stores. He learned the names of the river gates and the tides that move under coin, the way that a clever clerk can steal 5 years by saving 5 days, the way that mercy given early is cheaper than justice demanded late. He learned that oaths must be fewer than laws and firmer than rumors, and that a man who keeps an oath even when drunk is a treasure worth locking a city around, and that such men almost always ask for very little in return. He kept a small dragon of wood on his desk, carved by some unknown hand, and he touched its head without noticing whenever he had to choose between 2 goods that did not fit in the same day. When he finally looked down and noticed, he moved the carving to the shelf and did not touch it again, and decisions came no easier. But he liked himself better for not asking wood to share a burden it could not lift. In the sept, candles leaned toward the boy king as if trying to share their fire without letting him feel their heat, and he thanked them, as he had been taught, because gratitude is a language that makes friends of strangers and good servants of fear. On winter afternoons, the city went blue at the edges, and smoke rose straight from chimneys like patience, and the boy saw that life is mostly keeping warm without burning your own house. News from the north said the wall still stood, and the men still watched, and the snow still remembered how to fall politely, which is to say without asking anyone's permission, and he slept better those nights. News from the Trident said the fish ran, and the reeds whispered, and the ferrymen charged unfairly and then forgave the extra coin if you told a good story, and he slept better those nights too. From the Reach came fruit, and from Dawn came wine, and from the Vale came iron, and from the Westerlands came a certain careless laughter, and from the Iron Islands came storms in letters that began with words like grievance and ended with words like tide. He kept all the letters and tied them with the same ribbon, because kinship is not just liking the same things, it is loading different things into the same basket and carrying them without spilling. He grew as even the unlucky do, and his calm changed from a surface to a depth, and people who did not love him learned to work with him because work goes better where the air is steady. He came to understand that a crown is not the point of a kingdom. A crown is the receipt, and the goods purchased are good roads and full barns and arguments that end at reasonable hours. He looked at the pit that had once housed the fierce and found in it a garden of weeds that flowered with shocking generosity, and he thought, not for the first time, that life has a talent for offering consolation a little too late and exactly enough. He permitted old songs to be sung in new ways, and young songs to try on old melodies, and he forgave a scribe who wrote dragon where he should have written wagon, because a world moves forward on jokes like that. In spring, he stood on a balcony and watched the swifts carve letters in the air, and he pretended he could read them, and for a moment he imagined the letters spelled out rest, and he answered aloud saying yes, and no one laughed. He never forgot the price, because scars itch in heat and throb in cold, and no season refuses to be a messenger. But he learned to set the messages aside and eat his supper, and that too is a victory. Whispers traveled still, because whispers never retire, and some carried the shape of a sword meant for a hand that might one day claim it, and some carried the shape of a banner that had once been black and might one day be black again. Shadows of futures paced the corridors, looking for corners to claim, and the king let them pass, because corners are not a throne, and shadows are not soldiers, and tomorrow has never yet asked permission to arrive. Out beyond all comfort, above the old forests and older stones, the sky kept its own counsel, clouds moving like thoughts too big to hold, and far to the north, the ice practiced patience the way masters practice scales. The realm breathed, slow and long, and the breath reached the places breath always reaches if you do not interrupt it. The toes and the fingertips and the corners of locked rooms and the backs of old paintings and the hollows of trees where rain collects and memory likes to drink. And the old faces in the old leaves looked down and did nothing but watch, because watching is what they do and what they teach. And if the living are very lucky, they will learn to do it as kindly. Time put away its hammer and took up its needle, and the sewing it did in those years made fewer scars and more hems, and the hems held. In the end, when people told the story, they said that fire taught them something, and so did ash, that screaming taught them something, and so did the days after when everyone spoke softly, that dragons were chapters, and that living is the book. They turned out the lamps and let the moon finish the sentence. And the sentence ended not with a period, but with a breath, and the breath became sleep, and sleep became morning, and morning became work, and work became supper, and supper became stories, and stories became sleep again. And that circle, small and good, shone softly in a world that had once burned too brightly for anyone to look directly, and was now content to glow enough for kind hands to find each other and hold, while the rest of the world, large and long, waited for the next verse, which will come when it comes, and will be met, and will be managed, and will be survived, and afterward, as ever, there will be bread. Roads remember everything, even when men pretend not to, and the small roads remember most of all, because they are walked by feet that notice the weather, and by laughter that sets in slowly like dawn. A hedge knight in an ill-fitting helm learned that honor can be a coat you mend 100 times, and still it keeps you warm. He called himself by a name he had earned with blisters and kindness, and at his side walked a boy whose shadow was longer than the afternoon and full of concealed light. Fields with poor soil learned their conversation as the two of them passed, and the conversation was about bread and the price of justice, and whether chivalry is a coin that still spends if you polish it with hope. In inns where the ale remembers last winter, the boy watched the way mouths change shape when men speak of kings, and he practiced listening until it became a talent disguised as a habit. He kept his hair close and his name closer, and when he smiled, his whole face decided at once, and that is how you know a prince even when he does not wish to be known. Tournaments rose like tents of music in empty meadows, and lists became lines where young men crashed their pride together and called it sport. And the old watched and remembered to be careful. Horses tossed their heads and felt the bit too tightly held, and pantries emptied into platters because nobles love to feed strangers when the story tastes good. Beside those pavilions, oaths met wine and learned to slur, and oaths that slur are not oaths you should trust with anything you plan to see again. The hedge knight slept on straw that smelled of summer, and the boy slept as if someone had written a promise above his bed. And in the morning both of them woke to a different idea of themselves. They went where trouble was large enough to require small courage. They went where injustice had the smug grin of a man counting rent. They went where a lord's caprice had mated with a child's fear, and the offspring was a monster that thought itself merely rough play. They went where old banners had been taken out of trunks and shaken, and in their dust were names that remembered the word claim more clearly than the word mercy. Black fire whispers rustled through hedgerows as a fox moves, visible only if you already know what to look for, and the fox kept running long after the hunters swore they were home for supper. At a wedding where attention was stronger than wine, the boy learned to bow like someone whose blood might one day be asked to pay for an argument that began before he was born. He learned that lineage is a door that opens easily for friends and not at all for those who truly need shelter. He learned that kindness is not a policy, and therefore no one can be accused of treason for practicing it. He learned that a knight may be measured not by the polish of his breastplate, but by the way he lowers his voice near frightened people. There were days when justice cost a bruised cheek and a knight in stocks, and days when it cost something that leaves a mark even soap cannot lift. There were days when he raised a fallen boy by the elbow and said, "You're fine, lad." The ground only wanted to say hello, and days when he could not say anything that made a difference and still had to speak. The realm in those years felt like a table with one short leg and one long wobbling under every hand that set down a cup, and no carpenter was in sight. Kings grew and fledged and fell like seasons, and the crows kept their own ledgers, and somewhere in the ledgers a small name learned to become a large one. The boy, who had kept his hair close and his name closer, became a man whose ideas did not ask permission, and the ideas shone like polished steel in a room of damp wood. He took a throne in the only way anyone ever really does, by turning the weight of his family's history into a chair and daring it to hold him. He lit candles where others would have lit pyres, and in the light of those candles was a promise that he believed could be made real if only everyone held perfectly still. He had a friend whose shadow stretched to every corner of the capital, who counted coin like prayers and treated the ledger as a map of the kingdom's heartbeat. The friend loved order the way a surgeon loves cleanliness, as the only condition under which healing can happen. For a while, the kingdom breathed in a measured rhythm. For a while, the harbors kissed hulls with gratitude, and the markets set their prices quietly, and the bells rang for weddings more often than for wakes. But a boy born in heat with a crown-shaped cradle grows into a man who hears the hum of danger in every kind of silence, even the kind that means you are safe. Heiress to comfort the way one takes spice, more each year, until the tongue cannot taste anything else. His laughter sharpened, his moods prowled, and the wildfire jars dreamed green dreams beneath the city like jealous moons. He sat on iron and learned to bleed exactly as much as the throne believed he should, and when the cuts healed, he did not trust the skin that returned. He found in suspicion a companion that never slept, and the companion taught him a prayer that only has 2 words, and those words are them and me. He had beside him a queen who carried snow in her eyes and quiet in her hands, and he forgot how to be calmed, and the quiet became a smaller room inside a smaller room. In the great houses, ambition woke when the roosters did, and slept when the roosters did not. Because ambition is a farmer, it rises early and does not mind the smell of its own work. In the rock, a lion cub with a golden stare learned that if you keep accounts beautiful, you never have to apologize for feeding the household with meat. He learned to spend men the way other people spend coin, carefully, stacking their lives in columns that add up only if you do not look too closely at the faces. He learned that pride is an investment that expects a dividend, and that when pride is not paid, it collects with interest. At court, he served a king like a mirror takes steam, first with patience, then with beads, then with streaks, then with the cloth coming away green. When he set the realm in order, the king called him hard, and when he made hard things easy, the king called him arrogant, and when he did nothing, the king called him necessary and then again arrogant. He left because sometimes a man must put his hands back into the work he understands, or risk forgetting his own shape. In The Dragon Prince, music walked beside duty, and duty did not feel slighted. He played a harp that understood the silence between notes better than some men understand language, and he studied old books that do not boast and old prophecies that never apologize. He wore armor like a thought, and when he rode, he did not seem to be moving through the world so much as drawing it toward him on a thread. He saw the kingdom as a sum of errors that could be corrected, and he believed correction is a kind of love, and he was not wrong, only early. The great Tony at a lake that remembers faces like a second mirror put up more tents than stars, and drew more eyes than a summer storm. Banners licked the wind like curious animals. Ovens smoked with the labor of 10 villages. Copper clinked like rain in glad hands. Lords brought sons who wanted to be legends, and daughters who already were, and the grass learned to flatter for a week by laying down softly under silks. There beneath a weirwood that listened harder than usual, a mystery unfurled like a scarf in a breeze, and a crown of blue winter blossoms found the wrong brow and the right poem. A girl with a wolf in her laugh felt both seen and stolen, and a man with a hammer in his spirit felt both promised and betrayed, and a tower far away felt its outline grow clearer against the sky. Songs grew fat on that day, and the truth grew thin, and when the singers finished dinner, they began to eat the truth and found it sweet. The king's temper ripened into something that burst without touch. He whispered ideas to men who could make those ideas engines, and the engines were turned on people whose only crime had been to be in the way of a thought. He called for fire as if for a mistress he could not live without, and fire obeyed, because fire is polite to the hand that feeds it until the last moment. The prince began to walk in 2 worlds at once, one where he kissed his children, and one where he counted lines in a dream that told him the name of winter. The queen, who had once been patient, learned patience does not heal everything, and her prayer grew thorns that wrapped themselves around her mothering and did not let go. Whispers about succession, about sanity, about what a city owes a crown that has forgotten how to be heavy, crawled from tavern trestles to noble tables and tried on different voices. The hammer in the Stormlands kept its oath as long as a man can, without breaking in half, and then it broke and called the breaking justice. The wolf in the north, who had made a decision as a boy and learned to carry it like a sword without scabbard, went south because honor had become a rope, and he did not want to be the knot that strangled his friend. Names that had slept since the last rising were shaken awake, and grudges that had been folded carefully and placed in drawers were taken out and held up to the light. The banners unfurled so fast the wind did not feel properly courted. Ravens blackened the sky like a moving ink stain reading its own letter. The first skirmishes were ugly the way truth is ugly, with no music under them and no choreography, just men discovering the limits of bones and the stubbornness of leather. The king demanded dead men as a tariff, and the princes and lords who had been young when they first learned to bend refused the lesson now that they were old enough to know what it cost. A city on the fingers of the veil remembered how to say no to strangers with ships, and a stubborn redhead who loved the wrong things in the right order knocked until the door let him in. The mountains took toll in blood and time, as they always do, and victories there felt like wedges hammered into stone that cracked but did not fall. In the river towns, where fish are cheaper than lies, a war learned to breathe through its nose, slow and mean. A prince of battle tried to end a rebellion by catching it in a street and beating it like a drum with soldiers, and instead he found himself counting bells because every house had one, and each bell rung is a promise that neighbors will notice. The rebels escaped with mud on their boots and a story in their pockets, and the prince carried back to the capital an education that smelled of smoke. The Lion Lord watched the sky and decided the weather would change, and he reminded the realm that clement weather is just rain that fell in your field instead of your enemies. He led silence to the gates of the city and dressed it in banners, and the guards could not tell whether the silence was smell, sight, or sound, and that confusion found purchase in a keyhole. The gate opened like an eye that has chosen which dream to believe. Inside, a boy in white learned that vows are heavier than air, but lighter than children, and that you can die while keeping them or live by breaking them, and neither will feel like victory. Fire ran through corridors with a note in its hand that said, "Burn this." In a high room that had tried to be a church and a throne room and a nursery all at once, a woman who deserved better met men who deserved worse, and mortality arrived carrying a little flag with no color on it. Down in a hall that was a tongue of iron curved to taste fear, a king told a man to burn the city because a dream was ending, and the man chose a different dream. When he slid steel where duty's throat was, the world learned again that honor has two faces, and both of them weep. On a river's bank broad enough to host a country's decision, two armies looked like two fields of different crops meeting, and between them rode a single man with a smile that belonged to a painting he had never seen. He wore rubies that flashed like red fish, and a certainty that felt like prophecy doing math. Across from him, a man who had been a boy at a forge held a hammer, the way a storm holds itself. They met in the middle, where the river sprayed like wine flung in anger, and the song that began there is still being sung by people who do not remember the words and never will, because the words never mattered as much as the rhythm. The rubies flew, the smile did not. A crown unseated itself in three sounds: splash, shout, silence. The river carried away a great many things that day, including a theory about how the future should behave. By the time the hammer wielder raised his head, the world had found a new balance, and 40 old imbalances had pretended to be solved. In the capital, ash chose its corners. The Lion Lord brought gifts no one should bring, and a king newly made learned what victory looks like when it forgets to dress for supper. In a tower built to keep weather out of love, a woman with flowers in her memory reached for a brother whose face would be carved into ice in the minds of men who never saw him weep. She whispered a name, as if it were a prayer and a law, and she asked for a promise that would make sense only much later. In a room where candles would watch a boy learn the word why, the wolf bent under a load invisible to anyone who had not carried love like a stone in a pack, and when he rose he carried more than his own beating. The rebellion collapsed into triumph the way a wave collapses into shore, loud, and then suddenly tame. The throne accepted a man with a beard that remembered storms and a chest that had once held a laugh like a fire. His knuckles were maps of the choices that had brought him there, and he set those knuckles on the arms of the chair like stakes. He married convenience to old affection, and the wedding ate a great number of chickens, and for a while that seemed like enough of an answer to most of the questions. His friend stood beside him with a face made for lists and a heart made for loyalty, and the two found they could walk in step as long as the music stayed slow. But music in courts always speeds up. The debts of a war are seldom paid by those who owed them first, and the kingdom learned to cough silver the way a sick man coughs phlegm, often and without grace. Feasts grew dutiful, and hunting trips grew complicated, and the old habit of reaching for a tankard to answer a problem returned with a swagger. The queen wore a crown like a sigh and a smile like a defense, and her brothers wore their arrogance like perfume. In the north, snow rehearsed itself while wolves told one another that spring would be late again, and no one listening argued. In the stormlands, laughter died in throats when the Hammer King grew tired of noise that did not make him feel young. In the Vale, a boy with a face like yesterday learned to calculate the angle of men's interests, and he sharpened his voice to a needle. In the Riverlands, debts of blood and bread tangled like fishing line around rocks that did not care. In the Westerlands, a father practiced the art of waiting until that art became a religion. In the Reach, banners learned new embroidery to suit the fashion of a king who had brought peace but not discipline. In Dawn, sun on orange rind looked like gold coin on a plate, and the taste was more honest. On Dragonstone, wind threaded narrow stairs with the smell of salt and old grief, and a woman with a book that felt like a window taught herself to read the weather of a different world. She listened to fires and to rumors and to the sound her own heart made when the island slept, and the sound spoke of patience that burns and burns and burns without smoke. The realm settled into a shape that looked, from a distance, like calm, but in the shade of tall chairs, boys with knives learned to twirl them quietly, and in the corners of warm kitchens, women learned to listen to the footsteps of messengers and sort them by urgency before the knock. A man with a red smile tore letters in half and fed the halves to separate flames, because sometimes secrecy is the only romance that never disappoints. A Kingsguard with sunlight hair wore white like a sentence he had not agreed to, and he did his duty until duty taught him how to lie awake without moving. A prince with a name that had been a bell became a shadow with a voice, and the shadow walked corridors where the stones themselves grew tired of hearing his tread. Ships in harbors developed the habit of pointing their prows at the east on evenings when the air tasted of coin, and on those evenings men walked docks promising themselves stories they would never tell their wives. In brothels, politics forgot it had a public face, and in septs, piety forgot it had private appetites, and the city learned not to pretend surprise. Small folk continued their main profession, which is survival, and nobles continued theirs, which is believing survival is something they invented. The Hammer King stopped loving the work that had rewarded him and began loving the memory of the work, and the memory loved him back warmly and dishonestly. He chased boars and ghosts, and the boars bled, and the ghosts did not, and neither improved his mood. He had a friend who cleaned up after him the way a tide cleans a beach. Relentless, methodical, grumbling only in the registers you cannot hear unless you live on the shore. He had a wife who sharpened, and a brother-in-law who preened, and another brother-in-law who looked at the map and saw a future he could ride like a borrowed horse. He had a north to rely on, and a south to feed, and an east to dread, and a west to doubt. And he had a past that refused to sit quietly on the back shelf. He had a son whose mirrors all belonged to other men. And in the far places where no one listens unless they must, the cold lifted its head and said a word the realm had forgotten how to answer. A word that does not bargain, a word that does not apologize, a word that invites the living to prove they remember how to hold one another close enough to make heat. Summerhall kept its secret like a coal wrapped in cloth, and sometimes at night travelers on nearby roads felt warmer for no reason they could name. They told their children that the world is stranger and kinder than it looks, and if they were wise, they did not say what else it is, because sleep likes stories with too fewer truths than the day can carry. In castles, candles burned down to the thumb and were pinched out. In cottages, fires settled into their bowls and watched with eyes of orange. Across the wide night, the realm lay like a giant of old, breathing in and out, turning now and then, muttering names to itself without waking. Among those names were the names of hedge knights and boys, of queens who learned to wait, and kings who never learned to stop, of princes who loved books more than swords, and princesses who wore both like answers. Among those names were the titles of places that changed names more often than they changed walls, and of rivers that never changed anything, but still marveled at their own persistence. Among those names, quietly, lovingly, warned by hurt and steadied by hope, lay the syllables of the next storm. It did not yet have banners. It did not yet have songs. It did not yet have a day circled on a calendar or an omen that 3 farmers agreed upon. It had only the patient arithmetic of grievances and the gravitational pull of pride. But it had the night to grow in, and the night is generous to anything that knows how to wait. On the morrow, pigs would root, and merchants would haggle, and babies would teethe, and guards would practice, and lovers would quarrel, and wives would forgive, and men would not. On the morrow, the sea would go about its business, and the sky would pretend to forget, and the wind would practice its lies, which are always the same lie, that it is your friend. On the morrow, the king would wake heavy and go to sleep heavier, and think himself clever in the middle, and the realm would shift under his feet like sand, politely leaving a party that has run too long. On the morrow, ravens would comb their wings with beaks the color of endings, and fly toward places that do not yet understand how much they are going to need new ink. But tonight, breathe. Tonight, remember the hedge knight's straw pillow and the boy's decisive smile. Remember the lake where banners learned to flirt with the wind and a crown of flowers forgot its place and found its destiny. Remember the bells of a riverside town saving a rebellion by telling everyone where kindness was hiding. Remember the ruby, the splash, the silence. Remember the lion lord at the gate, and the boy in white at the foot of the throne, and the woman in the high room who deserved a door that never opened. Remember the tower, and the whisper, and the promise that wrapped itself around a name, and asked the world to hold its breath for 20 years. Remember the way victory smells when it has lost its appetite. Remember the way quiet feels when it has earned the right to last. Let the realm lie down beside you, large and tired and stubborn and dear. Let it put its old head on your shoulder and ask you for one more story before sleep. Tell it this one. Tell it that men walk and fall and rise and fail and love and ruin and heal, and that between the ruin and the healing there are roads. And on those roads a knight and a boy walked once, and because of that walk, the kingdom learned to find its heartbeat again when the music stopped. Tell it that Summerhall warms the night still, even if you cannot say why. Tell it that the cold has lifted its head, yes, but so have the fires in 1,000 hearths, and that the space between those two liftings is called life. Tell it to go to sleep. Tell it you will be here when it wakes.